Hey, it's Dirk from Sentry. In this video, we're going to talk about building your project or building this project. And one of the issues that comes up when we do that, which is trying to get a readable stack trace from a minified JavaScript file. So let's take a look at that original error we had. And I'll just hover over this and we'll see a preview of the stack trace. And you can see here that we get a reasonably legible stack trace. So I can actually tell that the error occurred somewhere in app.js, JSX, and we get at least some meaningful information here. I can see the module names, etc. Let's go through a build and send in an error and see what we get when we do that. So if I jump over to VS Code now, I can say we have a second error, and let's do a build and then run this off of a built file. So right now, I don't have a build. This is actually when I'm running dev, I'm running off of this source. So if I want to do a build, I can just do npm run build, and you're going to see Vite is going to build an output folder here with our assets, and you're going to get a minified JavaScript. So you're going to get this file. Now let's see what happens when we send in an error running off of this file. So if I do npm run preview in Vite, that is going to run our server off of this file. If we jump back over to Vite and I send in this error, now we can go back to our project and, to our issues. And let's refresh this, and hopefully we get an error that comes across here, our second error. And there it is. And if I hover over this one, you can see the difference now. The stack trace is effectively illegible. I can't read it. So how do we fix this? We fix this by creating source maps and telling Sentry about them. Sentry figures out about source maps in a couple of different ways, or we can figure it out. Easiest to just see this on a slide. So JavaScript source maps, 3 options to upload. The first is implicit. So we will try to optimistically fetch your source maps from your build directory. We don't recommend doing this because it's not explicit enough to get predictable results. Rather, we would prefer that you explicitly send us your source maps tethered to a given release. So this is an important point of note that source maps are tied to releases. You can have multiple projects that are subordinate to a release, but you upload source maps specific to a project and then specific to a release. And we'll see how to do that here in a second. We're going to focus in this video on sending them through the Sentry CLI. You can instrument this through shell scripting or just do it manually. Add it to your build process if you prefer to do it that way. You can also do it with the Sentry API. So these are both under the covers using the Sentry API, but if you wanted to, you could instrument it on your own without touching the CLI, and that's super useful, I think, depending on what your use case is. The other thing to point out here is if you're using Webpack, which I am not using it in Vite, but if you are using it, we have a Webpack plugin that will do all of this for you. In a future video, we'll talk about using the Sentry API in GitHub Actions to perform the same thing. So if you prefer to use GitHub Actions to do your CI/CD process, we can actually create a release and upload source maps directly from there every time you push. Okay, let's get back to actually generating these source maps. If I go back to VS Code, and I'm going to shut our server down here just for a second. And let me clear the terminal. And now let me get out of this minified JavaScript, and we'll say third error here just to showcase it when we get to that point. I'm going to delete this directory, and to designate that we want source maps created, we need to tell Vite that we want them created. So it didn't create them the first time, and probably shouldn't have deleted that so fast. We could go back and look, but trust me, it didn't create the source maps the first time because we're not directing Vite to do it. Most build tools have some directive to build source maps, and Vite isn't any different. It's using rollup under the scenes, and you simply pass it in an object that declares what you want the build directive to be. And in this case, we need to set source map to true. It's false by default. And then I'm setting a couple other parameters here. There's a lot of different build commands you can use in Vite. You can change the way the hashing works or remove the hashing, and there's lots of different rules that you can set up. But just to generate source maps, this is all we need. And now to generate them, we can do npm run build, and we'll notice a difference when we get into this directory. If I click in this dist and assets, now I see a map file has been generated. So now we just need to let Sentry know that we've generated this map, and hopefully that will give us a readable stack trace that ties to this minified JavaScript. All right, so how do we tell Sentry about that? Let me clear the terminal one more time. And there are a couple commands that we need. If you'll recall, I mentioned that source maps are tied to a release. So the first thing we need to do is generate a release. And I have a little DevTools thing over here to keep all these commands so I don't have to memorize them. We'll copy that command. I'm going to paste it in here. And if we just review it, this is just saying Sentry CLI, which if you don't have it installed, you'll need to install and configure it. But the Sentry CLI in the releases subcommand, the organization is our demo org, quick start. The project is our GitHub project. And then this is the release name. And I usually just make these the same and increment them with semantic versioning. But you can absolutely use whatever you prefer here, as long as you remember what that release is called. All right, we created a release. So we have our first release sent to Sentry. Now we need to let Sentry know about our source map. So I'm going to copy that command as well and just paste it into here. And now we can do the same releases subcommand, org, project, all that's the same, but we're using the files designation and the upload source map designator to say that for this release, now we want to upload this source map. And all we need to do here is give it a directory. And the directory is where our minified JavaScript and our source maps are. And the CLI will try to figure out in its own way what files need to go up and if any modifications need to happen to those files. I can copy the path here and then just paste that down into this source map. And that's an easy way to declare it. So let's go ahead and fire this off. Great. Now on this particular build, we have source maps uploaded, and you can kind of see some basic information here. Let's go ahead and npm run preview this. Now when I run preview, it's going to run it off of this file. So it should give us that minified JavaScript, but now we have a source map uploaded. It should give us a nice readable stack trace. If we go back to Vite, I'm going to refresh this. We'll send in another error. And if we refresh, at some point, this new error will show up here, hopefully. Let's see. 2 hours later. Sometimes it takes a while. There we go. And look at that. We don't have anything improved. We still have our minified stack trace. How do we debug this? The easiest thing to do, most likely, and once you get familiar with this, this will become more obvious. You won't necessarily need to use this tool. But we can use the CLI to see what went wrong here. And to do that, we need this event ID. It's going to evaluate the event ID and see why are source maps not working for this event ID. If I go back here, we'll go ahead and get out of this and clear this out. And let me grab the command. There's a command called source maps explain in the CLI that allows you to input an event ID along with your org and project, and it will interrogate that event and see what is wrong. So if we grab that event ID now, I can click on this and it says fetch the data for the event. Release name is right. It's got a valid exception, a valid stack trace. But here's a problem. The uploaded artifacts do not include this. It did find this. And you'll notice, and this is one of the most common problems that we have with source map uploading, the path doesn't match. So if you'll notice, there's an assets in this path and no assets in this path. So we need to tell Sentry about this prefix. And we do that by a add-on to the command that we issued earlier. So if I grab that upload source maps command, we can paste this in, And now we can designate that we want the URL prefix to include this tilde assets. If I go ahead and fire that off now, it's going to tell us that it skipped the files, and it did because the files have already been uploaded, but it prepends the assets to that file so that the stack trace matches. So let's do two things now. We're going to send in another error. I'm going to npm run preview. I'm not going to increment the error number because if we build again, it's going to erase our map and we'll have to upload it all over again. So we'll just send in a new error from the actual earlier error that we had. And if I flip back over here, before that error comes in, let's just take a look at our source maps now in our project. So if I jump over to the gear icon, we go to source maps, I can see there are 4 artifacts here. Why are there 4 artifacts? Because this was our first one with the tilde index, and this is what happened when we prepended assets with our CLI command that we just changed. You can see that the files are exactly the same. So great. Now let's go back, and now we have our third error that we just sent in. And now if we hover over this error, we can see, this is already getting better. Let's click into it and scroll down. And now we can see, by virtue of making that change to the URL prefix, we get a perfectly readable stack trace. Now we've introduced, or we have, another minor problem here, which is you can see right below where we're throwing our validation error message, we see a note from Sentry saying that our source file is not found. You'll recall in a couple videos ago, we set up GitHub and we set up the code mappings, but something appears to be wrong with those because typically here you would get a link to the GitHub source file that is causing this problem. So a link to app.jsx where our error is being thrown. I could either click on this link or down here, or there would be a link right here. So in the next video, we are going to fix this problem. Stay tuned.